Dear distinguished participants, welcome to the webinar addressing the future of government and its study of public administration, accountability for democracy by Professor Jos Raadschelders'ın. My name is Aslı Yılmaz Uçar. I'm a public administration scholar and also a member of Public Administration Association. And I would like to extend a warm welcome to all of you on behalf of the association. And it was founded in 2022 to promote the principles and values of justice, equality, and public interest in public administration through organizing academic activities, developing projects, publishing scientific works, and creating networks. And the first international scientific activity of the association will be held at the end of this month in Ankara. In the honor of the 100th anniversary of the Republic, the theme of the Congress was chosen as what kind of a public administration in the centennial of the Republic. As you might know, this webinar is also organized as a part of this Congress. We would like to once again thank Professor Jos for kindly accepting the invitation to deliver the keynote speech at the Congress. But due to the time difference between Turkey and the United States, the organizing committee chose to hold a separate online session prior to the Congress. So we are here today. And let me note that with Professor Yo's permission and also with the permission of you, our participants, this online session will be recorded and broadcast during the opening of the Congress. In this way, we believe that the keynote speech will reach a wider audience. I want to provide you with a short biography of Professor Jos. He basically does research about public administration theories, the history of government, comparative government, and civil service systems. He currently serves as the Associate Dean for the Faculty Development of the John Glenn College of Public Affairs at Ohio State University and also has been a faculty member since 2011. Previously, he served as assistant and also associate professor of public administration at the University of Leiden and at the University of Oklahoma. He served as managing editor of Public Administration Review, and he is still co-editor-in-chief. And he is also a fellow of the National Academy of Public Administration, NEPA. He authored more than 20 books, so let me give you just a brief list. Let's begin with the recent one. The recent one, The Introduction to Governance, Government, and Public Administration with Emil L. Franklin was just published. Mastering Public Administration from Max Weber to Dwight Waldo with Brian Fry. And Professor Jos, we all know this book actually. We are using for our classes, including me. And it's so pleasing that a new edition is now out. Another book he authored is The Three Ages of Government, from the person to the group to the world, which was published in 2020. Foundations of Public Administration with Richard Stillman. Government and Public Administration Perspective, Handbook of Administrative History. Okay, I'm sure Professor Jos will refer to a bit of these works during his speech. And as you see, actually, from this short bio, he's actually dedicated to public administration research in all fields. And it is seen from his works that he believes public administration an interdisciplinary field, and he's looking for traditions, principles, approaches that go beyond the national boundaries and that go beyond the time that we live in. So you can easily travel across the historical time and places as in the Three Ages of Government or in the Handbook of Administrative History. And I suppose that's the reason why Public Administration Association invited Professor Jos for a keynote address. And I'm quite sure that we will learn a lot and we will draw many conclusions about public administration and its future in Turkey from his talk. Okay, let's cut it here because I know everyone is waiting for his address. Before leaving the floor, I would like to introduce also our participants to Jos. I can see the senior and also junior researchers from different regions of Turkey, and I would like to welcome also you, our participants. It's great to have you here. As we go by the presentation, you are welcome to ask your questions by typing them in the Q&A box under the Zoom link. We will have a question and answer session at the end of the presentation, so you may also prefer to ask your questions in person. Okay, I would like to invite Professor Jos Raadschelder's to deliver his address on the future of government and its study of public administration, accountability for democracy. Okay, over to you, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Yukar, for this very kind invitation, or for this very kind introduction. And I would like to also thank Professor Nure Keskin for her invitation on December 12th of 2022 to address your first conference. I didn't know it was your first conference, so I feel even more honored that you picked me. As I said when we were talking earlier this morning, I am very boundedly rational. The older I get, the more I'm aware that I don't know much. I know a few things, but what I'll do today is talk about the title that Dr. Ukar listed for you, but I've written out a text that is 36 pages without references. I've sent that paper, the most recent version of it, to Professor Keskin, and she will be more than able and willing to share it with you. I will read up a few parts, a few small parts of my paper, and then I will take it a little more on the fly because I have too much detail in there to cover in even 45 minutes. So thank you for the invitation. I feel deeply honored, and I wish you all the best in the years to come, and whenever I can give a little help or suggestions, you know where to find me. Growing up, I had no idea it was in a democracy. We celebrated Liberation Day in the Netherlands on May 5th, the end of the National Socialist occupation in the country of my birth and nationality. And you will recognize I no longer say German, because there were plenty of Germans who didn't really like what happened in the 1930s and 1940s. In our family, May 5th was celebrated, even though the young ones, myself included, didn't know about the holes in my mother's legs because of edema during the winter months of 44 and 45. And I didn't know about my dad being shipped home from a German labor camp after 2.5 years of work because he could no longer walk. Ignorance must be a bliss. Yes, indeed. It is a bliss for the young people regarding almost all issues, lessons, and challenges of life. The only exception for those young ones is that they will learn, and actually will have to learn, that caring for and sharing with others based on a sense of reciprocity and fairness is central to the survival of humanity. Obviously, that is done through the eyes. Obviously, that is done through example and through challenges and issues big in the eye of a child. What about democracy and its rule of law? Is that too big of an idea for a child? Is it even too big of an idea for an adult? Is democracy in general such a big idea that we're only beginning to understand about what it takes to succeed? What can and should we do to assure that citizens understand the position and role, their position and role, and the position and role of government in society, and why that is different, especially in democratic societies, from most historical governments? Being a professor, you will not be surprised to know that, in my view, it's indispensable to have education about what it means to be a citizen in a democracy rather than being a subject in an autocratic system. Allow me to go back to that comment about caring and sharing with others as important for the survival of humanity. Collaboration is so important that it is deeply embedded in our genetic and psychological makeup. In fact, without these, we most likely would not have survived amid animals with greater speed, or with more fearsome teeth, or with longer claws, and who have the advantage of walking on all fours rather than being bipedal, which exposes our most vulnerable body parts. We survived through collaboration and encephalization, and thus we developed the capacity to accumulate experiences and pass them on to the next generation. Just consider this fact. Our species has existed on this globe, for all we know, somewhere between 200 and 300,000 years. But it is only 6,000 years ago that the need was felt to institutionalize formal arrangements for governing the imagined community that we had become part of. A few were considered or considered themselves as leaders. The rest followed like herd, like animals, as subjects. It is puzzling that after a few 100,000 years of some degree of egalitarianism, humanity so quickly shifted to hierarchically organized social relations. 2,500 years later, during the Atlantic Revolutions, a phrase coined by the American historian Joel Palmer, the basis was laid for an experiment in large-scale democracy. I say experiment because of all our assumed intelligence, we have not quite figured out what it is that makes democracy successful and how we can protect it from those who lust for power. After the Second World War, it appeared that democracy was on the rise across the globe, and these decades happened to be the years that income inequalities declined significantly for the first time in history. By the time that Fukuyama declared democracy to be the pinnacle of civilization, its decline had already begun. With the rise of populism and populist parties on the right and the left in many democracies, and with its emphasis on populist politics that pursues policies aimed at harnessing a party's raw power by exploiting and fanning the voters' fears and prejudices, rather than developing a responsible politics that pursues policy with an eye on the needs of the people at large, we must wonder why democracy is so fragile. Mettler and Lieber identified four threats to democracy: political polarization, conflict about who belongs in society, just think about the influx of refugees and migrants, rising income inequality, and aggrandizement of the executive branch over the other two branches of government. I'm getting ahead of myself, and I think there are several necessary conditions that we can identify that are relevant to understanding the success of democracy. But I have not found in the literature a sufficient condition yet. For lack of a sufficient condition, I'll just mention a few, which in my view then are some necessary conditions. First, for democracy to thrive, right? First, self-restraint on the part of the individual and on the part of organizations. Or in the words of John Stuart Mill, my freedom, your freedom begins where mine ends. My freedom to punch you stops at your nose. We have to recognize that the individual can only thrive as part of a community. We have to accept the authority of government as a neutral arbiter in individual, organizational, and institutional conflict and tensions. 4, we need to expect some degree of knowledge about the position and role of citizens and government in a democratic society. In authoritarian societies, knowledge about citizenship and government is not expected, simply that you obey and that you understand the operational rules of interaction. Citizens should accept and expect that government acts upon the interests of all people. That's questioned. They will have to accept government's lead. They should know that public authority is negotiable, and that those acting in the public interest can be held accountable. Now, in my text for today, there are 3 concepts that are really important and that I won't go into detail. First, there is government, right? So I have a general definition of government that I came up with for that book that I co-authored with Richard Stillman. Then there is a definition of government that works for most of history, when government was something above people, where you and me were subjects. And then a third definition, where government is actually servant to the people at large, who then are, in terms of political theory, sovereign. Now, government, you understand, is different from governance, because there are plenty of bodies in society that contribute to the governing of society. Just think about guilds, about all sorts of associations, sports clubs, church denominations, take your pick. And then accountability is important, because especially in democracies, we like to think that we can hold individual and organizational actors accountable for their actions. Now, this was not normal for most of history, right? Because for most of history, government was seen as a property of the one in power, who was supported by a ruling elite. And that ruling elite occupied positions in the military, the priesthood, in trade, etc. right? And in what I call the second age of governing, people could only hold as subjects those in power accountable by means of uprisings or rebellions, and they were mainly tax revolts. In the third age of governing, all actors can be held accountable: citizens as taxpayers and as sovereign, elected office holders as representatives, and hopefully as trustee and guardian of the common good, and career civil servants as experts and servants of the people and of those who work in elected office. Now, when I talk about accountability and democracy, a key concept is, and it's a term that started to come into use the end of the 20th century, the beginning of the 21st, is the administrative or governing capacity. So how do we assess governing capacity? A lot of folks do that in terms of personnel and revenue. What is available to implement public policy? A lot of people do that in terms of measuring in outputs, shorter term and longer term outcomes. People measure or assess capacity in terms of the extent to which there is collaboration between public, non-profit, and private sectors in the delivery of services. In some countries, that's bigger, as in the United States, than in others, as in, say, the Netherlands. I have a little different take on understanding and assessing government's capacity in order to get to an understanding of accountability for democracy. And that has something to do with what we talked about before this webinar started, namely the institutional makeup. When you think about I'll keep my watch out. When you think about the institutional makeup, people tend to think about the branches of government, how a bill becomes a law, what voting regulations there exist, who is eligible to vote, etc. I think about institutional capacity in a very different way, and it starts with the foundation of our behaviors, in my view. I came across, some 15 years ago, kind of by accident, literature in primatology. Maybe because there was this guy at Emory University, a Dutch guy, Frans de Waal, who has published a lot on chimpanzees and bonobos. Yeah. And I was reading that and I thought, I'll be darned. I had been making notes since 1978 when I read this book, The Early State, by Klaassen, who was a professor of anthropology at Leiden, and Skalnik, a Czech colleague of his. And I've been fascinated ever since with the emergence and development of government over time. Don't ask me why. You can ask yourself why something interests you. You know, I can't quite explain it. But I've been making notes about it for decades. And one body of literature I had not considered was primatology. So I'm starting to read into primatology. And that is actually important because it is since the 18th century that a number of people observe, and it starts already with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, with Condorcet, and then in the course of the 19th century, several people saying the same thing. Jefferson, or was it Madison, in Federalist 51, that we're basically animals and that government is a reflection of our animal instincts. The same is written in 1937 by John Maynard Keynes in his general theory of money and something else, you know. So I looked at the primatology literature to get a sense of what it is that makes human ticks and what differentiates us from animal behavior. Now, Bertrand Russell, and I'm now going on the fly, right? So Bertrand Russell in 1932, Herbert Simon in 1969, and Benedict Anderson in 1984 all pointed out that society and community are artificial, at least in terms of the institutional arrangements that people create to govern themselves. And they reflect those institutional arrangements. They reflect human nature, as Madison said in Federalist 51. Given that institutional arrangements are artificial and human-made, the responses themselves, our responses to governing and how we see ourselves as citizens, are artificial in a way as well. Now, people for most of their existence have lived in physical communities of people. And a physical community is 150 up to 150 people maybe, where things work on the basis of collaboration. You know, you need each other for survival. because you don't have the claws, the teeth, and the speed of some of the animals. Yeah? Now, people still live in physical communities in this day, even in an urban environment. Just think of an extended family, a sports club, a church denomination, a labor union, a neighbor association, and so forth. But those physical communities are embedded in a much larger imagined community. Yeah? So there's Ankara in Turkey. That's an imagined community of millions of people. How many do you know really well? Yeah? 5? Mom, dad, your kids, hopefully. Huh? In an imagined community of people, government becomes a necessity. That's why government arrangements occur. And one of the fun things that I found when reading that primatology stuff, I came across this quote by a colleague called Prof. I've quoted it in the text, that human beings, that the common ancestor of chimpanzee, bonobo, and human beings, and I quote, may in fact have possessed a mosaic of features. And isn't it fun to see in some philosophical and theological literature this reference to Saint Augustine, who mentioned in the 5th century, no kidding, of the common era, that human beings are torn between conflicting forces. We can be collectivist, we can be individualist, we can be egalitarian, we can be hierarchical, we can be submissive, we can dominate, we can be peaceful, we can be aggressive, we can conform, we can try to be unique, we compete, but we also have a sense of community. And all that is reflected in the institutional arrangements for how we govern. And I lay that out, especially in chapters 3 and 4 of the 3 Ages of Government. That is, by the way, access free. You don't have to pay any royalties or any price because it's open access, that book. So when I then look at the institutional capacity, I first looked at so the foundation of our behaviors and how the institutional arrangements reflect these conflicting behaviors in ourselves, that mosaic of features. So I first looked at the institutional superstructure to assess the capacity of government, and that is generally the most common approach. People look at structure of government rather than functioning. Because when you look at structure, that's something I laid out in a book with an Israeli colleague in 2015 on comparative government. Governmental structures across the globe are rather similar in terms of territorial layered organization of jurisdictions and organizational structure, bureaucracy. And then the fact that pretty much the entire globe is now part of a state, of a territorial state, yeah, with the exception of Antarctica. So the institutional superstructure is one that has the branches of power, so attention for that. That authority and responsibility are fragmented across those branches of power, and that you have to take a look at the interplay between levels of government, which is, for instance, in France, more centralized, Paris influenced to the regional and local levels than it is in the Netherlands, which is considered a decentralized unitary state. America as a federal system where state governments are supposedly have or share sovereignty with the national state, the United States, and with some local governments having a fair degree of autonomy under home rule, where other local governments are creations of the state. We also have to look at the fact that there are many actors in government and around government. In historical governments, there were few actors who had influence or access to public policy making, let's face it. But at the moment, there are many actors in government, and they are identified in the paper, as well as swirling around. And that's no more so the case than in democratic systems, where people as individuals, and certainly as organized groups, try to find access into public policy making. Then you have to also think about the fact whether there are multi-party systems or two-party systems. Now, America has a two-party system, just as New Zealand and England has, for instance. In a multi-party system, it's first past the post, so the majority party gets to do whatever it likes. There is a good chance that develops into nana boo-boo politics. I'm going to do to you what you did to me when you were in power. Can I say anything else about what's happening in Washington, D.C. the past 5 years, 10 years? It's ridiculous. It's worse than kindergarten, I think. I am very much a Dutchman. I came to this country in 1998. I was 42. Yeah? I believe in a multi-party system, and I tend to agree with Arend Leipert, who moved after his dissertation defense at the University of Leiden in 1968 to University of Southern California, as that multi-party systems are kinder and gentler democracies, because you will always have to find a consensus. You have to cobble together a compromise, because you wouldn't have, as an individual party, a majority in parliament. So the institutional superstructure is important for assessing the capacity of government and thus accountability, how we establish that. The ideational substructure is possibly even more important, because that gets us into the functioning of government. That substructure is, of course, about culture, societal culture. And then you'd have to look at Turkey as compared to the United States or the Netherlands. So the United States is focused on this idea as a value that is very individualist. And in the research of the sociologist Hofstede, who happens to be Dutch, the Americans list #1 on that individualism, collectivism spectrum, right? Americans also have a strong belief in the market. Keep the market as little regulated as possible, because the profits that are made by the CEOs, etc., will be plowed back into the company and into nice salaries for labor. We know that trickle-down economics from the literature doesn't work, but there's still plenty of people in the United States who seem to hold on to that idea, and that provides then the basis for deregulation and privatization. There is a tension in the US and in other countries as well between what Thomas Jefferson called the live and let live ideology. So I don't bother you, you don't bother me, which basically means you can be free, you can be poor in the name of your own freedom, versus Herbert Crowley's idea of live and help live, which in my view, and the view of plenty of other people, certainly in Turkey and in Western Europe, is that government's moral test, is about how it treats those in the dawn of life, the children, those in the shadows of life, the sick, the needy, and the handicapped, and those in the dusk of life, the elderly. Basically, governments help people, help take care of people whom no one else cares for. And when it comes to children, it's basically orphans, right? So the ideational substructure is what emphasis is laid on the position and role of people in society. Who do we help, or do you have to pull yourself up by the bootstraps? Another element that has been increasing, especially in the Western world, and I cannot really speak for Turkey because I should have done some research, but I know no Turkish, that makes it a little difficult, is in the United States especially an enormous distrust in government and an enormous distrust in civil servants. Now, historically speaking, I can understand it. And there was no different in the Ottoman Empire either, because people working in bureaucracy worked for those in power. They did not work for the population at large, at least not explicitly. In democracies, things are turned the other way around. It's the people who are sovereign, and government serves the people through policy, through services, and performing a variety of functions. The distrust of civil servants and of government has been increasing. I'm linking it, or explaining it at least in terms of rising populist politics. Then there's another thing to assess administrative capacity that I talk about, and that has to do with the major changes in what I called the third age of government and governing. And that is when, at the time of the Atlantic Revolution, so that's the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century, that some things change at what I identify as 3 analytical levels. And I borrowed that from Kaiser and Ostrom, a piece that they had in 1982. First, the separation of politics from administration. That people would not be appointed in administrative positions on the basis of nepotism or friendship or being a relative. I remember from research that I did in the 80s that a mayor in Amsterdam thought, well, I have 28 jobs already. The 29th that now becomes vacant, I really cannot do, but he gave the job to his 3-year-old cousin. That was possible. It was possible that you could sell your job for a nice price. Heck, it was possible that you could farm out as a mayor the taxes. and say to a private citizen, you can raise the salt tax in the coming year or the beer tax, and you know that that's pretty hefty tax back then, yeah. But you pay the city $1,000 or dinar for that right. So separation of politics and administration basically means that people in administration, so the career civil service, are appointed on the basis of merit, so and that is educational and or experiential background. A separation of church and state. As a kid, I read The Three Musketeers, and I remember the Cardinals Mazarin and Richelieu having substantial influence on policy making in France in the 17th century. Yeah. It's something, that separation of church and state, that started, of course, with that conflict between the Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope in the 12th century, but it became law at the end of the 18th century, and that was placed in constitutions. Then a separation of public and private, and we know from the Roman Republic that private was seen as household and public was seen as everything outside. But it is actually with Adam Smith that public is seen as the economy, the market, and private as government. Then there is the emergence of constitutions as a basic foundation, and at what I call the collective level of analysis, that's the decision-making arena, the separation of office and office holder. There's a little more to that, but for the moment, that's fine. And it is upon that basis, that those features of democratic government, that a century later, especially local governments at first, and then later regional and national governments could respond to what I've called the triple whammy. That is industrialization, urbanization, and rapid population growth because of better healthcare and all sorts of discoveries from medical professionals, nurses and doctors, about how important hygiene was in clean water. Now, so when I try to assess administrative capacity, I realize, A, I need to look at the institutional superstructure. B, how things function and what drives policy making. So what values are deep-seated in a particular society of people? And then look at the extent to which democracy is established. Now, let me go toward the end of my talk. There are a variety of elements I mentioned that we have to look at if we want to assess democratic capacity, and then see how we can hold people and institutions accountable. Keep in mind that our psychological makeup is conflicted, that and that is visible in the institutional arrangements for democracy, that we recognize that collective action unfolds in a multi-government, in a multi-level environment that includes public, private, and non-profit actors, that there are multiple actors in and around government, and especially in democracies. That makes it really difficult to hold people, individuals, as career civil servants or as political office holders accountable. Can we really place blame on one individual or even one organization for mistakes made? And in democracies, it's far more difficult to hold people and organizations accountable than it is in authoritarian systems. Although, just by way to make sure, I don't want to go back to those times. There's an enormous amount of misinformation that people need to deal with nowadays. I don't need to remind you of that. And we need to understand much better and equip people as citizens about the position and role they have in society and the position and role of government. And that's where public administration as a study comes in. Yeah, I do believe in there being a future for democracy. And I think the study of public administration can help there, especially because it's no longer a study that focuses on organizational structure, on leadership, on specific administrative skills with regard to personnel management, budgeting and finance, program evaluation, or law and regulation. Since the 1970s, the scope of our study has increased enormously to include attention for representativeness, for organizational culture and ethics, for equity, for diversity, for inclusiveness, for non-profit administration, and I can go on. In fact, I think public administration has widened its scope, whereas the study of political science has narrowed its scope to focus on the political process itself. In most Western countries, this historically unusual institutional arrangement of large-scale democracy has survived and has deepened in the past 2.5 centuries. The foundations for that were laid around the 1800s, and that enabled the increase of the franchise of the citizenry occurred in the 19th century and allowed for quite effective responses to rapid social economic changes between, say, the 1870s and the 1920s. We perceive social change as rapid, and I see that in the literature all the time, and that the social and economic change are more rapid than ever before. But that is just our perspective, right? If we could step back in time and be one of the Luddites in England in the 1810s, we would experience it as just as rapid. We really cannot know the intensity of the social change that we experience because we're unable to see its impact because we are still in the middle of it. Yeah? Could it be that the turmoil in the natural, social, and political life in the 2010s and 2020s will, a century from now, be assessed as an anomaly, as a blip, so that democracy has proven to be strong and surviving? Or is it a decisive regression toward authoritarian hierarchical government where people are yet again reduced to being followers and subjects? And for that, we need time. Time can only tell. And I apologize for talking too fast because there is so much to talk about. And I'm deeply, deeply concerned about the future of democracy. I admit that. I think it'll hold. But the crazies that I see in this country, in the United States, it just baffles me. So I'll open it up for questions. I hope this was okay, Asli.
Sure. Thank you for this amazing presentation. Okay.
And as I said, colleagues, there is much more detail in the paper. And maybe I should turn it into a book. I don't know. Yeah, we'll see. We'll see.